Good afternoon. This is Aubrey Ann Gilmore with the Texas Department of Agriculture. CDBG Over Coffees are an informal webinar series held throughout the year to help you and your community implement a successful CDBG project. So grab your cup of coffee and let's get started. Today, we'll discuss the procurement of professional services using the pre-qualified list. Today's presentation is broken out into sections. First, we'll review the streamlined procurement method and discuss when utilizing this method is appropriate. Then we'll go through the process step by step for communities. After that, we'll provide guidance and best practices for service providers that receive solicitations. And finally, we'll end the presentation with an opportunity to address audience questions. Communities who apply for grant funding are responsible for identifying the person or firm that will provide professional services for the project if funded. For programs like Planning and Capacity Building, or PCB, this means selecting a professional planner. And for programs that do not involve planning activities, such as the Community Development Fund, this means a community should select a grant administrator. And applicant communities have a few options to choose from. An applicant community could utilize staff employed by the city or county, and typically this is an option selected by applicants with certified personnel that are familiar with the CDBG program and whose primary job duties are grant contract related. A community interested in self-administering a CDBG award should consider their administrative capacity before choosing this route. I typically recommend at least 20 hours of a full-time employee's workload should be dedicated to CDBG administration activities. Another option is that an applicant community could utilize their council of government to provide these services. Not all COGs offer administration or planning services, but for those who do, a COG may act as a subrecipient to the applicant community through an executed agreement. And finally, communities may hire a third-party firm to provide necessary services. These vendors must be included on the pre-qualified list, and the streamlined procurement method outlines the steps taken by communities to competitively procure a third-party vendor. So when is a good time to start thinking about hiring administrative and planning firms? Well, the short answer is right now. Once your community decides to pursue CDBG funding, meaning your community is considering applying, the very next step should be to hire an administrator, or for planning grants, hiring a planner. This is because federal guidance has become increasingly restrictive and prevents vendors from providing statements of work prior to being procured. Therefore, communities must procure service providers before they may be involved in preparing the application and prior to any project-specific discussions. The sooner your community awards a service contract to the firm or individual, the quicker they can begin working with you to develop a project and application. This is especially important as we'll soon be releasing multiple programs applications at the beginning of March. All CDBG applications are a significant coordination effort and have public consultation requirements, so be sure to allow your vendor ample time during the application period. So how do I determine which procurement method to use? Typically, most applicants who are hiring vendors for administrative or planning services will fall under the streamlined category. However, there are a few instances that your community may need to follow the steps outlined in Chapter 5 of the Implementation Manual for traditional procurement. Let's take a quick look. The streamlined procurement method is for service contracts under $50,000. I can't stress this next point enough. The $50,000 ceiling considers both grant and match funds. So a community that intends to budget for CDBG to pay for administrative services, but also intends to add local matching dollars too, should not exceed a $50,000 combined total. Secondly, the streamlined procurement method is for administration and planning services only. Engineering, surveying, and architectural design should be procured using the traditional method only. Also, a community following streamlined procurement will solicit to firms listed on the pre-qualified list and cannot select outside of those vendors. But don't worry if you don't see a firm you're interested in soliciting to. They can easily become pre-qualified, and we'll talk about that process in a bit. So most of our programs will follow the streamlined process. However, communities that are applying for larger fund amounts, like in Texas Capital Fund or Colonia Fund construction, may need to use the traditional method. So here's the big picture. This method of procurement has two phases. During phase one, TDA solicited applications to pre-qualify grant administrators and planning service providers. Individuals and firms interested in providing administrative or planning services then submitted applications to TDA. TDA then reviewed submittals for completeness and prepared the pre-qualified lists. It should be noted that the pre-approval of a grant administrator or planner does not include an evaluation of the quality of services offered. So since phase one has already been completed, we'll focus on the community's responsibilities and interested vendors' role in phase two today. In phase two is the community will follow the Streamlined process for the procurement of professional services. Once this is done, a community will have successfully procured their service provider and are clear to begin project-specific discussions and application preparation. And please know that for the sake of brevity in today's presentation, I'll frequently use the term service provider or vendor, which will describe both grant administrative firms and planning service providers. Let's get started on discussing the steps taken by communities during the Streamlined process. This first section is directed at communities, as service providers are prohibited in assisting in their own procurement. However, if you are an administrator, professional planner, or grant writer, it's helpful to understand the community's steps in the process so that you can advise them in a limited capacity. Listed on the screen are the steps that a community will follow in order to complete the successful procurement. One will be to identify their evaluation team and review vendor applications. Second step is to select firms to consider further. Into step three, they'll complete the phase two solicitation request for project-specific proposals. In step four, they'll receive and review proposals from interested vendors. And in step five, select a service provider using local procedures to award the contract. And in step six, work with the service provider to prepare an application or begin work. And if you're a visual learner, here's a flowchart depicting the steps mentioned in the previous slide. Step one, the community should first assemble the evaluation committee, or sometimes called the evaluation team. This group should be composed of at least 3 people, and at least one member should be a local official, such as a member of the elected governing body. Communities should ensure that there are no potential conflicts of interest between the evaluation team and any vendors under review. The pre-qualified lists are separated by service provided, one for administrators and one for planners. The pre-qualified lists of vendors and their corresponding applications, also known as a vendor's qualifications, are posted on the TDA website under the Professional Services tab. The evaluation team will review the application for each approved vendor listed. Once the review has been completed, the evaluation team will select at least 3 vendors from the list for solicitation. The committee may choose and is highly encouraged to consider as many vendors as it wishes. Keep in mind, one or more of the vendors selected for solicitation must qualify as either minority-owned, woman-owned, small business enterprise, or a Section 3 business. These self-identified categories are included in the vendor's application. Next, the evaluation team will complete Form A506 to request for project-specific proposals from vendors selected for further consideration. The completed A506 form will be sent to each vendor for their response. Ensure that a reasonable period of time is allowed for vendors to prepare and submit their proposals, such as 5 to 10 business days. And remember to print a copy of each form and retain for record-keeping purposes, as you must document proof that the A506 was sent to each firm. Also keep in mind that all documents involved in the procurement process are essential in providing verifiable sources during the monitoring review. So a best practice to implement would be to send solicitations with a delivery confirmation or red receipt. Here's a copy of the A506 form. Make sure to enter information into each field. The top section of the form is pretty straightforward. You'll see a date response due field, which the evaluation team will enter their due date after determining the reasonable response time. Next, identify the program community the community intends to apply under. This is essential information. If your community intends to apply for multiple CDBG programs in 2020 and wishes to consolidate their efforts in procuring services, a separate A506 form must be completed for each fund category. Then the description of anticipated project section, which you will use to provide any information that is available to describe the potential project. Examples might include water and/or wastewater system improvements, housing rehab, sidewalk improvements, or whatever your community's project priority may be. Then the services needed should be listed in the anticipated scope of work section. In addition to basic contract implementation services, does your community need application preparation services, assistance with navigating URA compliance or acquisition, help with federal labor standards? And finally, develop weighted criteria that will be used to evaluate each pool. This form lists many criteria that may be used. However, the evaluation team may list additional elements to be considered. Cost must be included in the evaluation criteria. The relative importance of each criteria must be assigned and listed on the table. And teams may use either a point system or categories such as very important, somewhat important, minor importance, etc. In step 4, vendors who are interested in competing for a service contract will respond to the solicitation. Vendors may use the optional form provided by TDA, which is the A507, or may provide information in their own format. In either case, the proposal should outline the services being offered and the proposed cost of those services. The proposal must also identify any potential conflicts of interest with the vendor and the project. The evaluation team must review and evaluate each proposal using the specific criteria established in the previous step. The committee or team will utilize Form A508 to document that the evaluation and selection process has been completed. The committee will then make a recommendation to City Council or Commissioners Court. Here's a copy of the A508 form. Make sure to enter information into each field. Up at the top, you're going to list the names of each member of the evaluation team. Then in green, you'll include the program that the solicitation was in regards to, and this should be identical to what you've included in the A506. In the blue, you'll list the respondents and the date that you received their proposals. In the purple, you'll enter the weighted criteria that was determined in step 3. And again, this would be directly off of the A506. And from there, you'll evaluate each proposal received under the criterion listed. And then you'll list each firm's results in the table. And finally, you'll list the team's recommendation to City Council or Commissioners Court. And you'll also list the firm that was formally selected and the date of award. So as a quick recap, during steps 3 and 4, communities will complete the A506 form and send this to selected vendors. And these solicitations can be submitted via email. Just make sure to request a delivery receipt. Then interested vendors will provide responses. And in step 4, the evaluation team will review the proposals and use the A508 to evaluate and select a vendor. And remember, if your community is applying for multiple CDBG programs in 2020, a separate A506 form must be completed for each fund category. So how does this work if a community is trying to procure services for multiple programs at one time? Easy. See the example above for a star community, Scoresville. They're interested in applying for FAST, DRP, and planning and capacity building in 2020. The city can identify one committee to complete the evaluation process and make recommendations for multiple service contracts. This means the evaluation committee will need to review qualifications for listed firms and select at least 3 vendors, doing this step for each program. It should be noted your committee can select different firms to consider for FAST than the firms they would consider for downtown revitalization. And conversely, a committee can send multiple solicitations to a single firm, requesting, for example, a proposal for both FAST and DRP. Then they'll develop 3 separate A506 forms, again, one for each program. These will be distributed to the selected firms and vendors will submit proposals. The committee will then generate a Form A508 for each program and evaluate the proposal submitted. At the end of the evaluation, the City of Scoresville should have 3 A508s completed and a recommendation for FAST, DRP, and PCB. Next, in step 5, a community city council or commissioners court will award the contract for professional services to the selected vendor. Note, the governing body has the final authority to award contracts and is encouraged to follow the committee's recommendation, but they may select another respondent if justification is included in the meeting minutes. A sample contract for administrative services or contract implementation is included in Appendix D of the implementation manual. So back to the city of Scoresville. The selection committee for the city has finalized their evaluation and has recommended XYZ Inc. for fast administrative services, ABC and Associates for downtown revitalization administration, and XYZ Incorporated for planning services under PCB. Then at the city council meeting, the council receives the committee's recommendations and awards 3 separate service contracts. Now, the community may begin working with the chosen vendor. Remember, it's only after formal award of the services contract that the grant administrator or planner may be involved in grant application preparation. If a service provider has been involved in project-specific discussions, recommendations, or decisions regarding a grant application prior to the procurement process, that firm may not be awarded a services contract. And as always, costs related to the preparation of an application are ineligible for CDBG reimbursement or matching funds. So in summary, keep all of your documentation of the procurement process to demonstrate if you have a compliance review. Complete the procurement process before working with a grant administrator or planner, and contact the Office for Technical Assistance if you ever have any questions. And remember that contracts greater than $50,000 should follow the traditional procurement procedures outlined in Chapter 5. Switching gears now, let's focus on the process from a vendor's perspective. As I mentioned earlier, the Streamlined process is frequently used by our community stakeholders as a method to procure administrative and planning services. The Streamlined process is exclusively for service contracts under $50,000, and communities solicit proposals from a pre-qualified pool of vendors. So how do I become pre-qualified? Well, our big push for application submittals was in January, and the 2020 pre-qualified lists are now posted on the professional service page of the website. But for potential vendors that are interested in becoming pre-qualified, just navigate to the hyperlinks highlighted in yellow for the list you wish to submit for. Read the RFQ instructions and complete an application. From there, TDA will review the application for completeness. Since the pre-qualified list is an open application period, new vendors are regularly updated on the published list. This slide is a duplicate from earlier, but illustrates where a potential vendor's opportunity is in the overall procurement process. The A507 is a sample response format that vendors may choose to use in formatting their responses to solicitations. This is not a required form, but may provide a framework for what information to include. At a minimum, your proposal should include the name of the community that sent you a solicitation, your firm's name and contact information, the program that was listed on the A506 that you received, the total proposed cost, identify any potential conflicts of interest, and list and describe the services offered. Occasionally, communities may send a streamlined solicitation, which is the A506, for work that you feel may, quote, above the 50,000 ceiling. If this happens, as a vendor, you've got a couple options. Either you can choose to compete for the service contract and respond with a proposal within the 50,000 range, or respond with a decline. It is not advisable to submit a proposal greater than 50,000 in response to an A506. It should be noted that CDBG has a 16% threshold for administrative costs paid for by grant funds. Administrative services can be paid for utilizing matching funds as well, but if the service contract was a result of the streamlined procurement, the total service contract is capped at $50,000 regardless of the percentage allowed. This means some programs with higher maximums, like the Colonia Fund construction, may need to use traditional procurement method if it's anticipated that a service contract will go beyond $50,000. And then for planning, you may want to look at the application guides in order to determine the planning cost threshold for a specific applicant. When having general conversations with potential clients, consider pointing them in the direction of this chart, to Chapter 5 of our implementation manual, or to my inbox if they have any specific questions. Speaking of questions, it's a wrap on my end, so if you have any, please send them to the email address listed or feel free to reach out to me via phone call. If you're listening in on our live webinar presentation, you can use the IM feature or unmute and speak through the conference call.